It was a crisp Christmas morning, and the streets were unusually quiet. The air carried a gentle chill, but it wasn't the cold that made Emma pause in her steps. It was the sight of an elderly man, sitting alone on a bench near the entrance of a small church. His shoulders were hunched forward, his gaze fixed on the ground, lost in thought. Something about the way he sat, his stillness, his quiet sorrow, touched Emma in a way she couldn't ignore. Emma had worked hard all year, scraping by to make ends meet. She lived simply, saving up whenever she could, and this Christmas, she had finally put aside enough for a small treat, a meal at her favorite Italian restaurant. It wasn't extravagant, but it was something just for her, something to bring a moment of comfort and normalcy to a difficult year. Yet, as she looked at the man before her, her excitement faded. The joy of her carefully planned celebration dimmed in the face of another's pain. She hesitated for a moment, torn between the desire to enjoy the one thing she had saved for herself and the undeniable pull to do something for this stranger. She stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently. The man looked up, startled. His eyes, tired and filled with something far deeper than sadness, met hers. He gave her a small, forced smile, but it quickly disappeared. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice rough with age and emotion. Emma didn't press. Instead, she simply sat down on the bench beside him, leaving enough space to show she wasn't intruding, yet close enough to let him know he wasn't alone. Silence stretched between them, comfortable in its own way. After a few moments, she spoke again. "Sometimes, just talking can make things a little easier." The man exhaled, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "It's Christmas," he said finally, his voice softer now. "I went to see my son today. Wanted to meet my grandson for the first time, but they turned me away. Said they had other plans." His words wavered, and for a brief moment, he seemed lost in thought. Then, he shook his head, as if dismissing his own feelings. "Guess I should have expected it." Emma felt her heart tighten. She had no words to erase the hurt, no grand solution to fix what had already been broken. But she could do something, something small, yet meaningful. She reached into her bag, pulling out the little bit of cash she had saved for her meal. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for warmth, for comfort, for a reminder that he wasn't invisible, that someone cared. She stood up, offering a small smile. "Wait here," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. The man blinked up at her, confusion flickering across his face. "I'll be back." As she walked away, she could feel his gaze following her. He didn't say anything, but in that moment, she knew she had already made a difference. And though she had no idea what would come next, she felt a certainty settle in her heart. Some things were worth more than a meal. Some moments, some choices, could change everything. Emma had spent months carefully budgeting every dollar, stretching her earnings to cover rent, utilities, and the essentials. She had learned to cut back where she could, skipping small indulgences like coffee from her favorite cafe or the occasional sweet treat. It had been a tough year, but through determination and discipline, she had managed to set aside just enough to treat herself to something special this Christmas. A warm, comforting meal at the little Italian restaurant down the street, her favorite place, where the scent of garlic and fresh-baked bread filled the air, and where, for just a little while, she could forget about her worries. She had been looking forward to this day for weeks, envisioning the moment she would sit down at her cozy corner table, order the creamy pasta she had been craving, and savor every bite without guilt. It wasn't much, but to her, it was everything, a small luxury she had earned, a well-deserved break from the relentless weight of financial struggle. She clutched her worn purse a little tighter as she walked, feeling the satisfaction of knowing she had managed to hold onto enough to make this moment happen. But then, as she neared the church, she noticed him. The elderly man sat slumped on a bench, his thin shoulders curved inward as if he were trying to make himself smaller. His hands rested limply in his lap, his head bowed, and his face, though partially hidden, bore an unmistakable look of sadness. Emma slowed her steps, drawn in by the quiet desolation that surrounded him. She told herself to keep walking, to go enjoy the meal she had worked so hard for. but her feet wouldn't move forward. She glanced down at her purse, the small sum of money inside suddenly feeling heavier than before. A quiet war waged in her heart. She had been so careful, so disciplined. She had waited so long for this one moment of comfort. Didn't she deserve this? Hadn't she earned it? The rational part of her whispered that she could not afford to take care of anyone else right now, that she barely had enough for herself. But another voice, quieter yet insistent, reminded her of something even more important: compassion. She stood there, torn between her own needs and the sight of a man who looked as if he had no one left in the world. She imagined the loneliness he must be feeling on a day like today, the ache of being forgotten. Her heart clenched at the thought, and she knew she could not simply walk away. Taking a slow breath, she adjusted the strap of her purse and turned toward the small shop across the street. She would buy him something warm to eat, something to remind him that he wasn't invisible. It wouldn't be the meal she had planned for herself, but maybe, just maybe, it would mean more. With quiet determination, she stepped forward, leaving behind the plan she had made for herself, choosing instead to bring comfort to someone who needed it more. Her stomach might remain empty a little while longer, but her heart felt fuller than it had in a long time. Emma stepped into the small shop, her fingers running lightly over the few bills she had left in her purse. The money she had so carefully set aside for her own Christmas meal was now being repurposed, and though she knew she was making the right choice, a tiny knot of anxiety formed in her stomach. She took a deep breath, shaking off the doubt, and focused on the task at hand. She walked through the aisles, selecting a warm sandwich wrapped in crisp paper, a cup of hot coffee, and a small bag of holiday cookies dusted with powdered sugar. Then, just before heading to the register, she spotted a small display of Christmas cards. Most were bright and festive, covered in images of snowflakes, wreaths, and glittering trees. She picked up a simple one, its design understated, but its message inside was warm and sincere. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled a pen from her pocket and carefully wrote a few words. "You are not alone this Christmas. Someone sees you, and you matter." Her hand trembled slightly as she signed her name, just her first name, simple and unassuming. The thought of him reading it made her feel both hopeful and vulnerable at the same time. Would he accept it? Would he appreciate it? Or would he brush it off? Too accustomed to being overlooked and forgotten? As she handed the money over to the cashier, she felt a pang of guilt. This was everything she had saved for her meal, the one thing she had looked forward to for weeks. But as soon as the items were placed in a small paper bag and she stepped back into the cold air, her hesitation faded. This wasn't about her anymore. Emma made her way back to the church, her pace slowing as she neared the bench. The elderly man was still there, his posture unchanged, his face shadowed by sorrow. She cleared her throat gently as she approached, careful not to startle him. "Excuse me," she said softly, holding out the warm coffee. "I thought you might like something hot." The man looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the item she held. His hands trembled as he reached out, wrapping his fingers around the cup. The warmth seeped into his palms, and for a moment, he simply held it, as if savoring not just the heat, but the gesture itself. I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Emma smiled, placing the bag beside him on the bench. "There's a sandwich and some cookies, too. Just something small." And she hesitated, then pulled out the Christmas card, offering it to him. "I just wanted you to have this." He took the card slowly, as though afraid it might disappear if he moved too quickly. His fingers traced the edges before carefully opening it. As he read the words inside, his lips pressed together, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Then, to Emma's surprise, tears welled in his eyes. He turned his face slightly, blinking hard, as though trying to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to spill over. "No one's given me a Christmas card in years," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought people had forgotten me." Emma sat down beside him, her heart aching at the thought. "You're not forgotten," she said gently. "Not today." The man took a deep breath, still clutching the card as though it were something far more valuable than paper and ink. For the first time since she'd seen him, His posture shifted, less weighed down, more present. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice filled with a sincerity that sent warmth through Emma's chest. "You didn't have to do this." Emma shook her head. "I wanted to. No one should feel alone on Christmas." The man studied her for a long moment, as though trying to understand why a stranger would show him such kindness. Finally, he nodded, his lips pulling into a faint but genuine smile. "Merry Christmas," he said softly, and for the first time that day, the words carried something more than just routine, something real, something filled with gratitude. Emma smiled back. "Merry Christmas." For the first time that day, she felt lighter, as though in giving away what little she had received something far greater in return. Emma hesitated for only a moment before she spoke. "Would you like to come to my place for a little while? It's not much, but it's warm, and we can share a meal together." The elderly man looked at her, surprise flashing in his weary eyes. He hesitated, as though unsure if he should accept such an offer, but the kindness in Emma's expression reassured him. "I wouldn't want to intrude," he said softly. "You wouldn't be," Emma replied firmly. "It's Christmas. No one should be alone." After a brief pause, he gave a small nod. "All right. Thank you." They walked side by side through the chilly streets, the air crisp with the scent of pine and distant chimney smoke. Emma's apartment wasn't far, a modest space on the second floor of an aging brick building. She led him up the narrow staircase, her heart beating a little faster as she wondered what he would think of her home. She had done her best to keep it tidy, but it was small, and times had been tough. She unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting him enter first. The apartment was cozy, though it bore the signs of struggle. A few dishes sat drying in the sink, and the furniture, though clean, showed its age. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights blinking unevenly. On the table, a pile of unopened bills rested beneath a coffee mug, their red stamps marking them as overdue. The elderly man took it all in quietly, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He noticed the frayed edges of the couch, the worn-out rug, the stack of envelopes that had been carefully pushed aside. Emma saw his gaze linger on the bills, and for a moment, she felt embarrassed. She hadn't invited him here for pity. "It's not much," she admitted with a small, apologetic smile. "But it's home." He turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened into something warm. "It's more than enough." Emma motioned for him to sit as she moved to the small kitchen area. She had planned a simple meal, just enough for herself, but she would make it stretch. She heated up a pot of soup and set out some bread, slicing it carefully to make sure there was enough for them both. As she worked, the elderly man sat quietly, watching her with a thoughtful expression. He had met many people in his life, had seen both kindness and indifference, but there was something about this young woman that struck him deeply. She had given up what little she had without hesitation, and yet she asked for nothing in return. "You're very generous, Emma," he said after a moment. "Most people wouldn't do what you've done today." She turned, setting 2 bowls on the table. "I just did what felt right. No one should be alone on Christmas, and I know how it feels to struggle." His gaze held hers for a long moment before he finally nodded. "It means more than you know." They ate in comfortable silence, the warmth of the soup settling into their bones. The elderly man savored every bite, and Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet fulfillment. She had spent Christmas differently than planned, but somehow it felt more meaningful than any meal she could have had alone. As they finished, he leaned back slightly, glancing around once more. "You work hard," he observed, "but things haven't been easy for you." Emma hesitated, then sighed. "It's been a tough year. I lost my job a while back, and finding steady work hasn't been easy. I do freelance projects when I can, but some months are harder than others." She gestured toward the stack of bills. "I was hoping to get back on my feet soon." He nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. He wanted to say something, to tell her the truth about who he was, but he held back. It wasn't time yet. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "You've already helped me more than you know." Emma smiled back, though she didn't fully understand the weight of his words. To her, This was simply the right thing to do. But to him, it meant much more. He had come to the church that morning feeling forgotten, but now he felt seen, and he knew, without a doubt, that he had met someone truly special. The next evening, as Emma sat at her small table, sorting through the pile of bills that never seemed to stop coming, a firm knock on the door startled her. She glanced at the clock. It was late. Hesitant, she stood and made her way to the door, her heart pounding just a little faster than usual. When she opened it, she was met with a sight she never expected. Standing before her was the elderly man from the night before, but this time, he wasn't alone. Flanking him were two sharply dressed men in suits, their briefcases in hand, their expressions professional but warm. The elderly man held an envelope in his hand, and as he looked at her, his familiar kind smile returned. "Emma," he said, his voice steady, but filled with something deeper, something resolute. "May we come in?" She blinked, stunned, before stepping aside. Her tiny apartment suddenly felt even smaller with the presence of the two well-dressed men. The elderly man sat down in the same chair he had occupied the night before, but this time, his posture was different, more upright, more composed. The weight of sorrow was no longer as heavy on his shoulders. "I owe you an explanation," he said, folding his hands on the table. "You showed me kindness when you didn't have to, when you yourself were struggling. That's something rare in this world." He glanced at the men beside him. "And I want to do something for you in return." Emma shook her head, still confused. "You don't owe me anything. I just wanted to help." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's exactly why you deserve this." He handed her the envelope, watching as she hesitated before taking it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, and as her eyes scanned the contents, she felt her breath catch in her throat. A check, a substantial amount, more than she had ever seen in her life. Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard, her mind racing. "I can't accept this. This is too much." He reached forward, gently closing her hand over the envelope. "Emma, I haven't been entirely honest with you. My name is Charles Whitmore. I'm a retired attorney, but I still have a firm that works under my name. I've spent my life helping people who have been wronged, and last night, I saw someone who deserved justice." She stared at him, her thoughts colliding in her head. "I don't understand." Charles nodded toward the men beside him. "I know about your employer. I know they withheld wages, treated their workers unfairly, and let you go without what you were owed. My firm is going to represent you, free of charge. We're going to fight for what's rightfully yours." Emma's hands covered her mouth, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. No one had ever stood up for her before. She had resigned herself to the idea that life was unfair, that she would always have to struggle, always have to find a way to scrape by. But here, in this moment, someone was telling her she didn't have to fight alone. Tears pricked her eyes. "Why would you do this for me?" Charles smiled, his gaze kind. "Because you reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten. That kindness, given freely, has the power to change lives." The next few months passed in a blur. Emma's case went to court, and with Charles and his firm by her side, the company that had treated her so unfairly was forced to pay everything they owed. She no longer had to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table. More than that, she had gained something even more valuable, a renewed belief in the goodness of people. And Charles, he had gained something too, a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he'd lost. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness didn't just change one life. They had the power. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. For Emma, a simple act of kindness, one that she never imagined would bring anything in return, changed her life in ways she never could have foreseen. It wasn't about seeking rewards or expecting something in return. It was about the human connection, the understanding that everyone, at some point, needs a helping hand. We often go through life absorbed in our own struggles, thinking that we have little to offer. But what if the smallest gestures, holding the door open for a stranger, offering a kind word, sharing a moment of warmth, were the very things that could change someone's world? Emma's story reminds us that kindness has a power beyond measure. It reaches beyond the moment, beyond the immediate act, and ripples outward, sometimes returning in the most unexpected ways. Think about a moment when someone's kindness touched your life. Maybe it was a friend, a neighbor, or even a stranger. Maybe it was a smile on a tough day, a helping hand when you needed it most, or a word of encouragement that lifted your spirits. These moments, no matter how small, stay with us. And just as we have been on the receiving end of kindness, we have the ability to pass it on, to create a ripple effect that continues far beyond what we can see. So what would you do if you were in Emma's place? Would you give up something small for the chance to make a difference in someone else's life? Have you ever experienced kindness when you least expected it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with your loved ones, and help spread a message of kindness. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing uplifting and inspiring stories to the world. Stay with us for more heartfelt journeys. Click on the videos on your screen to explore more stories that will lift your spirits and brighten your day.